So what does flying look like in the era of COVID-19? As lockdowns are lifted, governments are looking to implement regulations to limit the spread of the virus. But the measures now, they vary from country to country. Well, take for instance, wearing masks. China requires masks on planes and in airports, the same for Thailand. But in Japan, only airport staff are required to wear masks, not passengers. And in some countries, masks are only compulsory on board flights, not in the terminal. Temperature screening will also become commonplace, but some countries want even stricter rules. South Korea is requiring additional checks for international passengers, while Indonesia requires aircrew to take the temperatures of passengers 30 minutes before landing. More airports are also reorganizing check-ins and baggage drop-offs to reduce contact and crowds. And even in-flight catering might take a hit. Thailand has completely banned food and drinks on board flights. But the most controversial debate appears to be about how many people can board a flight and whether the dreaded middle seat should be left empty to ensure social distancing. That would limit airplanes to 2/3 normal capacity, and that's not enough for most airlines to make a profit without increasing fares. In the US and Europe, it's not compulsory to leave the seat vacant, though some airlines have done so voluntarily. Malaysia and Indonesia have told airlines to carry half their usual loads. Japan, South Korea, China, well, they don't require an empty middle seat, but passengers must be seated as far apart as possible. All right, now for a closer look, we're joined by aviation consultant Mark Martin. So, Mark, let's address this first question first. You know, different airlines have different guidelines. Shouldn't there be a common set for airlines across the board?
Good evening. Thanks for having me today. I think the key challenge we're dealing with is how the pandemic has spread individually in each region and how each region is actually looked at handling this. So what's unique here is that nearly everything spreads on how we're transmitting the virus. While individually regulators and airlines are coming up with their own steps, I firmly be a unified connect between every region in the APAC, in ASEAN, as well as the larger Asia Pacific, Middle East, with handling this and ensuring measures work. Because, you know, while we may have checks which are more frequent prior to landing, effectively it's suppressing it and not letting the virus go in to the host country. So even within the aircraft recirculating systems, air conditioning, collectively a standard SOP should be set in place. And I absolutely agree. Regulators from the region need to come together and come to a single working document that works for airlines as well as airports.
Well, one bone of contention seems to be about the middle seats and should they be left empty or not. Now, how would airlines make a profit with such measures in place? Would it even be sort of worthwhile?
Well, I mean, you know, let's look at it this way. An average airline does an occupancy of roughly about 75%. So if you're going to blank off the middle seat and skip an aisle, then we're looking at break-even loads to be about 45%. So that means 45%, and the rest, at least 40%, has to be paid by somebody, and that's going to be the paying passenger. So a typical ticket will go up nearly 4 times. It's not viable, it's not sustainable, it's not going to work out. And airlines cannot even substitute that middle seat by carrying cargo or shipments and so on, because it becomes a safety hazard in the event of evacuation. Clearly, the only step that we can possibly do is ensure that everybody is screened prior to departure, that all those seated, we know where they've been, we know whether they've been in contact with anybody or not. And we're going to have to try and fill up as much seats as long as it's safely possible for it to be acceptable with everybody. I'm not in favor of, skipping the middle seat or completely passing off on an aisle. I believe there should be some level of balance, because in effect what we're looking at is a 300-seat aircraft becomes a business class seating configuration of 170, 180, which is ridiculous. It's just not going to work out. So I think this is a very good time for everybody to come together. The first wave of COVID-19 has passed. Now, while we prepare and embrace for the second and third wave, I think the key imperative comes into play where we come to a working operating procedure that works great for everybody.
Mark, you mentioned that, the waves that's happening right now. So the virus is definitely easing off for some countries. People are likely to start traveling again. But how long will it take for the airline industry to recover from the pandemic? Because, if you look at it right now, these travels are only within the countries, the small little bubbles that they're creating.
Let's face it, it's not that demand for air travel is dried up. It's not that tomorrow morning we're going to start taking the ship or hopping on a boat. There is a need to travel. Travel is an imperative medium. The key question is, at what level are we willing to accept safety and from a health perspective? And I think the only solution to that is when we have a strong, stable, robust, and a sustainable vaccine in place and enough time to inoculate everybody prior to flying. So the important part that really emerges here, which is very, very critical, is having the right check and balance that one could establish as part of your operating system. And the second, getting ready for when the industry rebounds, because the supply has been stopped. Once the supply is opened up, once it is certified that everybody is being inoculated and has a vaccine, then we're going to start seeing a surge in travel. And that surge is the indicator for that surge is when we start seeing holidaymakers and folks visiting their families and friends and, taking an annual vacation. And we're expecting that to be at least, the earliest we can look at that is 2021 or 2022. So clearly, we're in this for the long haul. Airlines have to, grin and bear it. It's going to be hard. And the only solution I see is, what I call defer. Defer repayments, defer lease rentals, defer loans. And the governments need to step in, not with a bailout package. I'm not for a bailout package, but I believe some kind of a mechanism that eases expenditure layout on the P&L for all airlines in the region.
Indeed, the airlines are suffering as well. But thank you so much for speaking to us. Good to speak to you, aviation consultant Mark Martin of Martin Consulting.